Welcome to the Surviving Society collaborative and ongoing series with Sage Publishing's Social Science for Social Justice book series. This series reflects Sage's mission-driven approach to publishing by platforming emerging voices and enabling the dissemination of bold thinking that will inform the work of future generations of scholars and changemakers. In these episodes, we talk to authors from the book series about their research embedded in visions for social justice for all. I am so excited today to be in conversation with Jessica Horn. Hi, Jessica.
Hi.
And with your last name, Jessica Horn, George, can we have some bashment horns, please? Jessica, it's so great to be in conversation with you about your incredible book, African Feminist Praxis. And we're speaking now. I'm in London and you're in...
I'm in Nairobi, Kenya.
Hey, in Nairobi, Kenya, honestly. Like, so cool. It's so cool. I've been really fortunate to host this podcast in a way that's borderless, but it never stops being exciting to speak to someone on different continents, like on a podcast. I just love it. So yeah, it's so amazing to have you on the show. Jessica, how are you doing?
I mean, given the state of global calamity, yes. I think I'm doing okay.
Yes.
I'm giving thanks, which is, I think, what we need to do sometimes in moments when, again, a majority of people in the world are highly distressed. So I'm giving thanks for the fact that I can go about my day in a way that's considered normal for me, and that I have community and warmth and a roof over my head, and I'm not living with constant bombardment. So yeah, I'm giving thanks.
That's beautiful, Jessica, honestly. And I think one of the reasons why I asked you how you doing is because so many people that I speak to now are just feeling quite a lot of distress. Just to give listeners some context, we're recording this now. It's the 13th of May 2024. So when the history books look back at this episode, they'll know that some of the things that we're kind of living or bearing witness to at the moment is quite difficult I don't want to say it's difficult for us observing. It's not as difficult as being within it, but bearing witness to it you feel very helpless.
You do, but I mean, I think one of the things that was interesting about writing this book was that it really, allowed me to reconnect with the kinds of agency and the kinds of energies that are constantly trying to basically find a way out of the mess of the world. And, I was thinking a lot about Sudan because Sudan has a very, very long history, actually, of women's autonomous action and activism, centuries old, actually. But Sudanese women were, of course, very involved, especially young Sudanese women students were very involved in the revolution that overthrew Omar al-Bashir. And it's really devastating to think about what they did, how much they created in that moment of political transformation, but even in expression through art and poetry and music, how much they offered in terms of building a new Sudan. And to look at the state of Sudan now in protracted war and also managing what I would call a people-led humanitarian intervention, from the very beginning. There was very little global attention to what was happening in Sudan. I have a lot of Sudanese friends and colleagues and activist friends, and to just see how they, kind of personally had to mobilize, to evacuate relatives, to support community. So, it's an interesting one. At the same time, you're grateful for the amazing agency of people, and also just wonder why, structurally, we can't get it together to stop this level of distress and constant compromise, that we have to put up with in the world.
Jessica, thank you so much for bringing into this conversation agency. For me as a sociologist, this kind of tension between structure and agency is something that I feel like I grapple with every single day now. To what extent does self-autonomy and agency for marginalised folk bring us the social justice we so badly crave, desire? To what extent does a too much focus on that, take away from the structures at play that keep us where we are. Like this tension, I feel like this is what we're constantly going through. And I loved how you discuss it and bring it through in the book as well.
Yeah, I mean, I do think we have to pay attention to both. We're in, a political moment that has pushed us more towards an individualistic understanding of the world. So I think even the ways that our world has sort of almost passively been shaped by social media, which is also shaped by a very particular social imagination. It was a group of tech bros, as they call them now, who drew on their own cultural understandings, right? Their own sense of values and ethics and what they thought was important in terms of understanding the self, and used that to shape social media. And so social media became a medium that really prioritized the individual. And and has now then become the force of celebritizing the individual, making it more difficult actually to articulate a collective self. And again, it came out of a very particular cultural imagination, obviously one fueled very much by consumer capital, playing into, some sort of narcissistic desires that perhaps exist in all of us. But, it's interesting to see. So I think it's in this moment, the reason why we're also constantly asking, is there, structure and agency, is that is it a dialectic? Is it a contradiction? Does it pull against each other? Is partly because we're now so steeped in individualism. In reality, everything is collective. We live in society, we live together. Everything is collective, everything. And I think when you start looking at African feminist agency, you realize that it's always collective. In the book, I had to draw an anecdote because there's a lot that hasn't been written, or written in a way that's easy to cite, or isn't located in places that are easy for academia. And so I interwove references with stories because I know some of these people, right? And so I just use a story as a way to enter into the universe of the world of activism at the time. But it's interesting, even where I use individual voice, that voice is always pointing to a collective, right? That is doing this intervention. There's nothing in this world that is done by just one person. And particularly when it comes to activism, activism cannot exist without a collective. I think one of the, perhaps for, where across the Anglophone world, we're very exposed to African American history. So to perhaps use an example from there, Rosa Parks is always represented as this kind of individual, brave woman who one day, was irritated about having to sit at the back of the bus and refused that racial segregation and decided to do something different. And what is always invisibilized in that story is the fact that she was a trained organizer. And actually, that act was not just one woman's irritation. It was actually a strategic intervention that was representative of a collective, right, effort to challenge systems of, of racism in lived reality. So I think it's that kind of idea that every time you see an individual voice, you hear an individual story, that's act of defiance, that act of resistance, that act of radical imagination is ultimately always fueled by, always rooted in, always supported by, always inspired by, right? Collective reflection, collective thinking, collective desire, collective wish for something to be different.
Honestly, Jessica, I needed to hear this. I needed to hear this because, I think that so many of us, it's just the fact of naming collectivity, I think is political and powerful in itself, because we are all always in collectives, and almost like the emphasis on individualism sometimes make those of us that are within collectives of people imagining and working, it even makes us forget that is what we're doing as well. So I'm just so grateful for you bringing that into this conversation. And I'm going to roll back, Jessica, because the listeners want to hear more about the author behind the book. That's part of what we do at Surviving Society. So Jessica, roll back. How did you get into this work? Tell us the story. Who is Jessica Horn?
So I was raised in an academic family. My father was a university professor. He taught political theatre and literature at a time in African universities when, that was very linked to the processes of independence and post-independence imagining. My
Yeah.
mother also, was studying for a PhD. She studied political science and literature after a nursing degree. I was raised with a sense that knowledge was critical, knowledge production was critical, and that it was important to reference and to know the work, to engage in knowledge production, not just written, but to engage in the thinking around what we do. And also, my parents were also part of academic traditions that were always practical. They were trying to deal with political questions of the moment. And so they were always about a praxis. After my, tertiary education, went straight into practice. And I've been a practitioner ever since, 2 decades of practice. But I've always stayed connected to knowledge production
Yeah.
because I do think that, again, that's why I was interested in praxis, because what we do is also a form of thought.
Yes.
We have to get over that Cartesian idea that doing is not thinking. It is. Everything we do, is a form of thought, right? And is also a form of knowledge production. And certainly when we're doing it in order to incite or elicit change, right? It's always based on an analysis, and it always produces analysis, right? Because we do things and the world responds, power structures respond. And so we also learn things as a result of that about the nature of power, its weaknesses, its concerns, the ways that it exerts itself on the world. So yeah, I mean, I was also, kind of location wise, really do come from, came out of decolonizing South. So, Southern Africa, the South Pacific, um, and so also was always around people who are doing the work of decolonization, but also thinking very much about it. So those have always been my reference points. So again, it's always been an interest in understanding the world, but also from the vantage point of people who fought to shape it, because their ability to do that was erased by processes of colonization, with all of its attendant, oppressions, including gendered oppressions. So that location of, looking from the South, um, and thinking about, the power of the so-called oppressed, right? And the agency, and also the creative production and expression, and the cultures, of the many Souths of the world.
It's always so humbling and inspiring to speak with scholars, people and activists that have been kind of either grown up or came of age or been around decoloniality, decolonization in practice within former British colonies, empire. Like, it's always so inspiring, like to put voice, faces, names to those that are working in collectives to unravel extraction, segregation, like all these things. Like, so it's so incredible to hear that is part of your process and how you come to be as a scholar as well.
Yes, and what's so interesting, it's actually the majority of the world. So it goes to show how conventional knowledge production and publishing in particular really do privilege a minority, because, in real terms, that should be the analysis that we're taught, as kind of the mainstay of curricula. That should be the majority of the books you read, because it actually represents the majority of the world. So again, it really does show you how the world is shaped and how it's positioned, in particular when it comes to knowledge production and to publishing and the written word, which is still, in the power structures that we live in, it's still paramount.
Yeah.
You can sing all you want. You know what I mean? You can talk all you want. But in reality, what is written is actually the most powerful. And so it's important to trace, who's writing and who isn't, and to really try and change that, because I think that's also one of the ways that we will be able to, undo the coloniality of being that, is framing still so much of our lives.
Coming on to the book, like, what were the motivations behind this book? Like, how did it come about?
Well, in a way, it was motivated by both absence and presence.
Yeah.
So in terms of absence, as I mentioned, I came out of studying, and actually, even while I was a student, I was always involved in student activism, but I really went straight into practice and became a practitioner in women's rights and work around feminist transformation. Began with a lot of work around the body because focused on medical anthropology. I was very interested in understanding our embodiment, and how it's understood through, through society, through economy, through politics, and ultimately what becomes culture. And so I'd begun working around sexual reproductive rights, HIV/AIDS, and work
Mm.
around violence against women and girls from a feminist perspective. And then that kind of evolved into all sorts of different work, always in a Pan-African frame, always with, feminists from across the continent, but also around the world. And as I engaged in this, I just realized how little of it was being documented. And so I actually, over the years, particularly in African feminist space, had really pushed to document. And so, in our own way, often not so five-star shiny,
Yeah,
but at
yeah.
least present, had contributed to documentary projects through the African Feminist Forum, the Voice, Power, and Soul series,
Mm.
which is a coffee table book, but probably like the first profiling of that many feminists from the African continent in writing, also producing a video, like a film series of
Yes.
interviews. And so I just felt this real urge to try and pull some of this together to create, a kind of witnessing of the incredible activism that happened. And, also because I had been at it for a while, I realized, I have done a lot of facilitation and training.
Mm-hmm.
And I always try to bring examples of praxis into that. And I started realizing as I got older and basically was training new generations of activists, how little they knew about the previous generation. And I
Yeah.
realized that it was partly a crisis of documentation, that actually we didn't, put enough attention to invest enough resources in archiving. And of course, the world wasn't interested in it either. And so there was an insufficient archive. And so it was almost as if things were beginning again, whereas so much had been done. So that was really a response to absence, but really in a close, dialogue with presence. So many moments for me in writing this, I really did feel were like an act of honoring because the tremendous sacrifice, but also tremendous brilliance, strategic brilliance, insight, fundamental belief in the dignity and humanity and full rights, of African peoples more broadly, but African women and, gender non-conforming people in particular that exist
Mm.
in African feminist work. And, I um, was thinking about the Egyptian revolution and all of the, feminist activists who were involved in that. And, as I was writing, because I was writing story and things from memory, I had to get back in touch with people, and it allowed me actually to be in touch with people that some of whom I haven't spoken to in years, to just check that they were okay with how I was, describing them and
Yeah.
their contribution to the world. And so it just reaffirmed to me, this tremendous presence. Like it's actually kind of incredible to think that so many amazing people walk amongst us in this way, and again have contributed so much of their lives, sometimes at great detriment to their own health, to see a free Africa, to see, in Africa, to see a free world, to see a future that could have something that really looks like a full liberation. The last thing I would say is this, we are approaching an interesting demographic reality. So by 2030, they say 1 in 5 people in the world will be an African, which is not very far from now, which means that, around 1 in 10 people in the world would be an African woman. I think it's amazing how little um, kind of official knowledge production, how little self-representation, right? How little analysis and storytelling is out there as produced by African women ourselves. And so I really do think that the world also needs to catch up because there's been an erasure, intentional erasure. But it's going to bite people because, you're not going to understand, a good portion of the world. And I don't think that that's, a very intelligent way to be in the world.
We're
It's
here
not
to
an intelligent
stay.
way to be. We are very much here to stay, and
Yeah.
it's a growing majority. So I do think that, the presence is important to note. And again, it's important to analyze, to theorize, and then to be able to debate. There needs to be more so that we can, contest each other and,
Yeah. One
develop, new ideas and, sharpen, what we're thinking and, have a vibrant dialogue, the rest of the world.
one of the most powerful tweets I think I ever saw on Black Twitter was, we know we've reached freedom or emancipation if we are able to adequately critique each other while still loving each other. And it just really rung true for me. It's like, wow, yeah, we can't, it's so difficult to engage in critique because we're erased so much from knowledge production that it's like, oh God, like sometimes I feel like I can critique that person because they're doing really well in spite of being within an institution or a way of being and doing and producing knowledge where so much of us gets erased. So can't critique them. Like that's sometimes what you're kind of grappling with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I don't think African feminisms, again, have been given due engagement enough to become a canon, which is interesting. And I was reading a very interesting analysis actually by South African feminist scholars who were, asking the question of why is it that, in South African feminisms, for example, or even African feminisms more broadly, there haven't really been any sort of academic superstars, the way that we have, say, a Judith Butler or some of these, feminist theorists from the global north who sort of become like, academic superstars. Again, part of me thinks, well, I think we should honor people's incredible, intellectual contribution. I don't know if we need superstars unless we see it as stars in the sky. So constellations, like
Yeah. Collective.
multi-millions of stars in the
Yeah.
sky. So, and actually they're all present. They all form something. They all could be potentially of meaning to somebody. I think it's healthy to have, to not idolize, because it is just ideas. And, to be honest with you, writers have to be honest with themselves, in that I think when you write, you channel. You're channeling the world. And
Yeah.
so that means that it's partly you, of course, because you are the channel. So you shape, the way that the words come out and you shape, the vision of them, but you're writing in response to the world. And so in that respect, knowledge production actually always belongs to all of us. And I think in particular, when you're writing about, transformation and contributions of people, a part of that knowledge belongs to those people because those people are, what actually gave you the material and the insight, right, in order to create. So this interesting observation, and I think it's partly just because we haven't had the privilege of a publishing industry that has allowed African feminists to be in their multiples, particularly in books. And so, yes, of course, we are defensive. The critique sometimes can feel like attack, but I do think that, rigor is one of the most important aspects of political thought, alongside compassion, of course. But a compassionate rigor is actually critical, because we really do have to keep thinking and rethinking again. These issues don't belong to any of us per se as individuals. They're collective aspirations for freedom, and we're just trying to find ways to engage them, And so there's a humility that's always needed when it comes to thinking about you as a writer, as a scholar, as a knowledge producer, and what your role is in this, in this community, and what your contribution is to.
So, Jessica, what can non-academic audiences take from this book?
So I tried to write it in a style that bridges. It begins a little heavy in the referencing, only because I was trying to, again, give due credit to so much work that's been done to lay out some of the core arguments around African feminisms and to also understand a lot of the the history of praxis that has been written, which is in the legal domain and policy change domain. I think that's probably where there's the most publishing around African feminisms. I've tried to write it in a style that bridges worlds. And so there is story, there's anecdote, there's poetry, there's, quotations from contemporary music. And so hopefully it's readable for one thing. The second is that I do think that there is, particularly in younger generations, growing interest in feminisms everywhere. I think African Americans have really pushed an interest in Black feminisms, and now I think we're starting to think about that in far broader terms. So people are looking at Caribbean feminisms, they're looking at, Black European feminisms. And they're looking at African feminisms, which aren't always Black, pro-Black, but they're not always necessarily Black in derivation, because of course the continent is, has people of many different backgrounds, but positionality wise, that's relevant. So I think that there's like an interest, and so I'm hoping to be able to provide a little bit more insight into, Africa, the diversity, but also the very interesting sometimes very radical, very thoughtful, open-minded, progressive vantage point of African feminisms. Also, I think that the questions that I'm asking in the book are contemporary. We're living in a moment of polycrisis, and everybody is trying to grapple with certain things, like the question of care, because we're all kind of shattered, between the way that contemporary capitalist economies work, the speed at which they work, the lack of rest, the appalling conditions of them.
Yeah.
We're dealing with environmental crisis. We're dealing with, political instability. We're dealing once again with the rise of authoritarianism and that impact that it has in daily life as well as in law and policy. And so I feel like it gives, an example of constituencies who've been through this multiple times, and some insight again as to how they resist it, but also as how they maintain a sense that it's possible for something else to be there. It's possible to not have this level of nodal oppression, and to exist in a way that's different. In the chapter on pleasure, which again is, I think, something that, contemporary culture is really leaning into. I think partly because, things are just so down, like people are dealing with so much distress, constant distress and dislocation. Pleasure is now a big conversation. And I look at pleasure not only in its sexual embodied sense, but more broadly too, the pleasure of engaging in a world that has beauty and art and creativity. And I'm hoping that that will also be resource, an insight for people who, again, need reprieve, which again, I think is a collective desire. It's not just a desire in the academy.
Jessica, we haven't got long left. So one more question for you. Thank you so much for those beautiful answers, like especially the notes on care and pleasure, like really integral for us living, existing and working in capitalist societies and modalities. But I guess just one really for me now, like what's the bit of the book that you're most proud of?
I guess it's just a point of entry of feeling like, I came into this as an obligated witness, as like a kind of a scribe who needed to do some work, to contribute to an us. And so, to be honest, just writing it is what I feel proud of, because, also doing that as a mum working full time, finding the time, because I knew that I needed to. Bibi Bakari Yusuf is a Nigerian feminist publisher and academic, and she talks about the need for Africans to build an archival future. Because, if we look back, there's so little that was archived. In fact, a lot of our archives were destroyed, but then so little, right, was kept in any way that felt precious. And so she talks about the urgency of actually documenting the now so that there will be an archive to look back on in the future. And so I feel like if I've been able to do that in some way, and hopefully to honor again the agency and labor of African feminist activists across the continent, in a way that is, dignifying, and helps inspire a desire to write more about it, to document in more ways, then I feel like I've made a contribution. And for that, I would feel proud.
That's beautiful, Jessica. Jessica, it has been so inspiring to speak with you this morning. Thank you so, so, so much. listeners will be able to get the book in December 2024, and we have a discount code available in the episode notes as well. Jessica, it has been incredible speaking with you, and what a privilege it is that we live in a society where you, Jessica Horn, have produced this book about African feminist praxis. So thank you so much.
Thank you too, Chantelle. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe. To host or produce a series of Surviving Society,
get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.